Institute. I'm John Linchafsky, president of the Institute, and it is our great pleasure today to introduce a longtime friend of the school, Dr. Phil Williams, who is one of our country's great experts on the Near East, and particularly on the Anatolian Peninsula, its long-time history. Phil originally comes from Michigan. He has studied at the University of Virginia, and the University of Edinburgh, the University of Florence, and has a couple of master's degrees and a doctorate in international law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts. He has lived in 4 foreign countries, has studied and worked professionally with 4 foreign languages, French, Greek, Italian, and Turkish. A large part of his career was spent as an investment banker. Currently, he is in the real estate business, operating a small consulting business and lecturing on a variety of topics, including American history, Turkey, and the Middle East. He has been on National Public Radio. He has written commentary pieces on Turkey and the Middle East, published scholarly articles on the Ottoman and Turkish law. He spent a couple of semesters teaching in Istanbul on U.S.-Turkish relations. He has been a board member of the English-Speaking Union, a past Virginia state president of the Sons of the American Revolution, and has served on the board of the American Friends of Turkey for over 23 years. Marilyn is his wife, who's here with us, and we're delighted to have you, and they have 2 grown children. And so, Phil, it's a great pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, let me just add, Phil opened the first investment bank in Turkey. Is that?
Yes.
They're
For Bankers Trust Company, for some of you who are old enough to remember that bank.
terrific.
Yeah.
Anyway, the floor, please.
All right. Well, I thank you all for coming here today and for indulging my wife. She's my primary public relations agent and always has been and always will be. So I'm glad that she can be here today. I had some other friends and friends of our children, former colleagues that I hope could show, but it's Washington, D.C., and a lot of people have had to cancel who were going to come in from outside, with one exception, a new friend of ours here. So anyway, thank you for coming. And what I want to talk about today is something I'm very passionate about. It turns out I've been involved in Turkey and the Middle East for the better part of 4 decades, either as a student or an investment banker or a teacher or a consultant or something. And I've watched things develop, and I have a kind of a sixth sense about how people think in that part of the world. I had a little warm-up by living also in Greece and living in Italy, so I had a little warm-up on the subject of Turks when my wife and I were first married and lived in Greece. So I really feel like it's kind of a very much a second home, and we have great friends in that area. And it's not the subject of today's conversation, although I'm happy to field a question during Q&A, but I'm very disappointed at the more recent turn of events under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. But today, really what I want to talk about, I'd like to focus on this story of the Eastern question, war in Crimea, lessons. It's an old story, but I'd like to focus your attention, which sometimes people neglect a little bit. I want to look at geography today, and I want to look at perception, and in particular I want to look at threat perception. So I'm going to break the talk up into where I'll talk about historic geopolitical perspectives, the ancient world, Greeks, and Persians, Crusader perspective, Christendom, the West versus Islam, the Ottoman threat to the West, and Russian designs on the Ottoman Empire beginning in the 18th century. And then I will go more specifically into what we know of and think of, in particular, the term the Eastern Question, which is really comes to life in the 19th century. And we'll look at religion and within Christianity, Latin versus Orthodox, Western Europe versus Russia, strategic considerations, military and commercial considerations. We'll actually look briefly at the Crimean War. We'll look at the allies that were involved, where the Ottomans figured into that equation, and try to get a better handle on the subject of the Allied objective, which is really to contain Russian expansion by propping up the Ottoman Empire. For fear of letting it fall apart too quickly and uncontrollably, there was a huge concern that allies, not just contention with Russia, but between France and England and Austria, they might up all fighting each other for the spoils of this crumbling Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. And then we'll move to the current situation now, and we'll look at what I call the Eastern Question in its 21st century perspective here today, with Russian strategic goals vis-a-vis Crimea, Ukraine, Syria, and Iran. Again, you'll see the geography of what connects all that. And American NATO versus Putin's Russia in the empire today. So when we talk about threat perceptions, I think that Rudyard Kipling really hit the nail on the head in the late 19th century when he wrote these words that are famous to everybody. Unfortunately, the first sentence is better known, understandably so, than the second sentence, which is also important. The first sentence speaks to something which seems to be an obvious reaction and a means of explaining East-West tension here that we'll never find really any resolution to that conflict and that tension. The second sentence I find very interesting, where he's basically saying, as you can see here, well, at the end of the day, there's neither east nor west border, nor breed, no birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. So I've always thought that this was very prescient, very useful, and something people know, and the second sentence is something they don't know, which is also significant to keep in mind. So let me spend a little bit here on geography before we go into the Eastern Question in particular, and make the point known to you all that kind of depends on where you're standing. Now here, by way of hyperbole, I've created a map. There's a map here that you all, many of you have probably seen over the years. It's a New Yorker, or more particularly somebody from Manhattan's perspective of what the world looks like. And you can see out here on the periphery, Asia and so forth, and South America, some down here in Europe and what have you. And by way of contrast, but to make the same point, it's an idea of what the world looks like in Beijing. Again, hyperbole, but you see, you very quickly get over to, oops. You find yourself in the Pacific here in a hurry, and all of a sudden you can see Latin America on the far right. Am I on this? Well, anyway, you have Latin America here, you can't see it. And in the distance, Europe and Africa, America, and so forth. So this is by way of exaggeration, but trying to make the point that the world looks differently depending on where you stand. This, as Americans and Europeans, is what we would basically think of as the world as we generally might agree to what it looks like in that hemisphere. And we will focus on this concept between East and West that gets defined here in the Dardanelles, leading up to the Sea of Marmara from the Aegean, and Greeks on one side and Persians and other threats to the east of them. So this concept of threat perception between east and west, and it exists in the east as well. I will spend more time on the west, but it has a provenance that goes well beyond the 300-year-old period, 300-year period that I'll be speaking about today. The provenance essentially goes back to pre-Christian times. And I will just give you remind you all of Homer's Iliad and who the good guys were, the Greeks, and who the bad guys were, the Trojans. So there's already, we just move up about 500 years and we get to Herodotus. And Herodotus is writing, and he says, and I quote, "To attack the Persians had to cross the Hellespont," the Dardanelles, "crossing from east to west and from Asia to Europe," unquote. So already in the millennium before Christ appears, we have a world in which one famous historian here, who didn't make this up out of whole cloth, but reflecting a perception and perspective that was already well developed here of threats coming from the east. Now, this continues. You know, there is a chance for this conflict basically is continued by the Romans. Alexander the Great is the first great Western counter-strike against threats from the east, defeating Darius III in the Battle of Issus in 332 BC. And the Romans pick up, dealing with the eastern threat. And we get to a sort of cartoon version by a cartographic, geographic historian who put some boxes here which, however simplified, tell about a world coming into this first millennium after Christ. Early on, we have what the Greeks refer to as the ecumene, the known world, and the known world is has these major powers in it, and you enter the door of this box by Gibraltar, and you end up out in Persia, and you have some smaller kingdoms, principalities around at that time, and peoples. And you basically have what he describes here as a Western Empire, sort of defined geographically by the Adriatic and Malta. And you have this Hellespont, he's got here as the door, that's sort of bridged to the Eastern Empire and what we think of as, you know, the area of Iraq today, and then following in the next box further east to Persia and Afghanistan. And you see the Suez River coming here, in the Red Sea, and the Suez coming in here in the middle of the box, and the Gulf out here entering into Persian Gulf into Basra. Again, it's fanciful, but it sometimes helps people to visualize what's going on here. So this takes us into the Byzantine world, and you have many of you been to Istanbul? Okay. All right. Well, you will certainly know St. Sophia either because you saw it in person or you've read about it. But Justinian completes this incredible basilica, the likes of which takes another 1,000 years to be produced in the West at St. Peter's in Rome. And you see that by 1453, Constantinople is finally conquered by Fatih Sultan the Conqueror, and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk turns it into a museum in 1935. So there is a Byzantine world here, sort of protecting Christendom at the time, and the world seems to be fairly steady, but not for long. It isn't long before we have Huns and so forth beginning to suffer from inadequate food resources and beginning to look west. So you have people in the east saying, "Go west, young man." Here's another one of these maps, which gives you a perspective that you might not normally have, but does create a sense of the peninsularity, going from east and west to east. And it is precisely the way the world, in a sense, was found and gets conquered by these various tribes from the Asian steppe, who go as far as, you know, Goths into Italy and Visigoths, Western Goths into Spain. But it gives a sense of the world that might be easier to understand if you came from the Asian steppe rather than coming from Europe or the United States. So, so now the Byzantine world gets a little bit more complicated to maintain here, and you see the beginnings of other empires developing in Poland and Germany and so forth, and beginning across North Africa. And you have Byzantium here, and you have these Seljuk Turks who come into Anatolian Turkey, who started coming west off the Asian plains for the 7th century, particularly the 8th century, fought with the Arabs and were defeated. They came in relatively small numbers, but the Arabs, the Abbasids of Baghdad, were wonderfully impressed with the fighting skills of these Turks on horseback, and after a while they decide maybe they should just hire them and bring them in as a Praetorian Guard. And then as things happen with Praetorian Guards, they eventually overthrow their rulers, and people and they sort of divide up the difference, the expansion of Islam between the Caliphate and the Caliphs, who deal with the spiritual matters of the faithful, and they turn the sword over essentially to Seljuk Turks, who begin to carry Islam into Anatolia and down to Egypt and across North Africa. It's interesting that in the Persian, in the courts in Baghdad, when speaking about law or religion, it was all done in Arabic. The language of the court itself was in Persian, but the language in the army, in the Urdu, was Turkish. It was Turkic, because all the military matters essentially had been turned over to these Seljuk Turks, who had accepted Islam and had become quite powerful, and basically said, okay, you look after the spiritual side of life and we'll take responsibility for expanding the Islamic Empire west. So the next threat that comes from the east, we have this new threat from Islam carried by the Seljuks. The next threat Genghis Kublai Khan, and then followed by eventually by Tamerlane. And I think I particularly find this map interesting. It's a Mongol's eye view of the world, and there they are in the Russian steppe, Siberia and cold forests further north, and China down to the south. But as they look west, and they say, how am I going to feed my people? Better grazing, pillage, wealth, let's go west. So this is sort of a fanciful notion, hemmed in by the Gobi Desert in the south, and the frozen tundras in their north. They look west, and that may be what the world kind of looked like to them as an objective. The next threat, of course, is the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans were actually spared the wrath of the Mongols, mostly because of their geographic location. Most of Anatolia was governed by the Seljuk Turks. Their capital was eventually in Konya, right here. And Osman I and his tribe of Turkic peoples were sort of right here on the coast. And the Mongols got all the way into central Anatolia sufficiently basically to break up the Seljuk rule and the Seljuk kingdoms. And then they were eventually defeated by Mamluks and Ayubs coming from the south, Saladin successors, and finally forces the Mongols to retreat, or as many of them did, as so many conquerors do, they stayed, got married, better weather, better food. In the meantime, it left this Turkic tribe here on the Aegean coast, founded by Osman I in 1299, and it's his great-great-grandson who eventually conquers Constantinople in 1453. And it turns out that the Byzantines were having a hard time first dealing with the Huns and the first waves of hordes to come, then weakened further by a battle that takes place in the middle of the 11th century out on the edge of the eastern edge of Anatolia in an area called Malazgirt, where the first time a Christian army is defeated by a Muslim army takes place. So this it's just a handwriting on the wall. The Byzantines are weakening, and as the Ottoman Turks, who are survivors of the Mongol invasions, begin to expand in Anatolia and cross the Dardanelles and begin to expand into the Balkans, very often by virtue of negotiation with the Byzantines. So, well, if you'll protect this passage, this trade route for us, so forth and so on, we'll allow you to occupy certain areas. So, literally, by the middle of the 15th century, when they get ready to lay siege to Constantinople, Constantinople is in fact already surrounded. It literally is already virtually surrounded by Muslims. And when this call, Ottoman Turks, when this call for support from the West is come bail them out, it's sort of like, we don't know you anymore. When Constantine established the empire, moved it from Rome to what is today Istanbul, to Constantinople, and established it as a capital in the east, all those people that arrived were speaking Latin. But within 200 or 300 years, all those people essentially got absorbed by Greeks, the Greek Orthodox that were speaking Greek. And you end up having all these various Lateran councils, and you end up with disputes within the Western Church, and finally this great schism at the same time that the Byzantines are getting defeated in the eastern part of Anatolia for the first time, army to army. You have this great schism between the Catholics and the Orthodox. So all of a sudden the Byzantine world now is beginning to come unraveled. And when the Byzantines asked for support from the West, the guys from the West said, you know, we've been fighting the Arabs. we've been fighting the Moors out here. And we're not doing deals with them. We're trying to take back the Reconquista. We're trying to take back from the 12th century, 11th, early 12th century. We're working hard to reclaim Catholic Iberia. We're not doing deals, we're fighting with them. These are famous guys like Beaugest, and if you read Middle French, the songs of Roland, La Chanson de Roland, and there's a whole business of trying to roll back the Muslims in this reconquest of Spain, and they turn to their Byzantine people who don't speak Latin anymore, have no real association with Western Christendom anymore. They're really more Eastern now, and saying, you've been selling out to the Muslims. Why do you expect any support from us? Which would explain why the Fourth Crusade never got any further than Constantinople. Supposed to go to Egypt and take Egypt from the Ayubs, and they only got as far as Constantinople. And you would think that these Christians were Muslims, dire enemies of one another, because as many of you will know, the Latin Crusaders were basically slicing and dicing Orthodox Greek Christians indiscriminately in Constantinople to a greater effect than they were any Muslims in the era. So there's been considerable cultural and political and religious divorce between the East and West of Christendom. It falls. So this sort of leaves us with Constantinople, now Istanbul, in control of the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks controlling all the states of the Maghreb, all the way over with the one exception, they never conquered Morocco. having by this point still holding parts of Spain, but they were about to finally be kicked out by Ferdinand and Isabella and the Latin Crusaders in the West. And you now have this sort of world that is pretty well divided between the cross and the crescent, which kind of begins to look like a world that we recognize today. So by the time you are here, in the 15th century, the world is looking at. Now, Christians can be fighting each other in the West, and Muslims are fighting each other. It actually only gets worse. The Safavid Shias fighting against the Ottoman Turks within the Ottoman Empire. But the fact of the matter is, this huge swath of territory is now controlled by Islam, by the Ottomans, and you have Western Europe holding on, Western Christendom, with their greatest fear being the Turks in the 1520s. First arrive, 1527, arrive at the gates of Vienna, get turned back, and then they show up again in 1682 or 83, where John Lanchowski's ancestors, the Prince Seversky, managed to turn back, after having lost to him 2 years before, managed to turn back the Ottomans at the gates of Vienna, and you get this gradual rollback. Now compounded by a power that's beginning to develop in the West that's based on technology, based on Reformation, based on free thought, based on Renaissance, and so forth. It's allowing Europe to begin to achieve things. They literally, one of the reasons for developing great ships that could travel the oceans was to circumvent the Mediterranean, which had, by the 1400s, and certainly the first half of the 1500s, had become known as the Mediterranean Lake. You couldn't, the Europeans were paying taxes on everything that was coming from the east, and people were paying the Ottomans coming and going to the Middle East on this Silk Road, which the Chinese are now busy trying to reinvent, as you know, today. So this is a world where the astrolabe, which is reintroduced through Andalusian Spain and the Arabs, the ancient learnings of the Greek philosophers and Galen and medicine and so forth, there's a technology transfer that starts, especially in the 12th century, through Al-Andalus in Spain, to the benefit of Western Europe. Now, all the translations that had been lost with the burning of the library in Alexandria and so forth, well, some of these volumes had been maintained and were translated into Arabic, and that learning benefited Baghdad and the Abbasid Umayyad, and more particularly the Abbasid Muslims. But that information found its way across North Africa via Al-Andalus into Spain. That information included a lot of things that came in Latin, which meant that the kings and queens and princes could send their scribes and academic monks down to study and to learn Arabic and to translate from Plato and Aristotle and so forth, translate that into Latin. But then who could read Latin at the time? Very few people, but it was the beginning. Now what happens in that story is that 200 years later you have this vernacular language is being developed by Dante and Shakespeare and Racine and Corneille in France. Now all of a sudden the scholars are going down and they're now translating the Latin texts into the vernacular languages in this explosion of information that came from the ancient world And one of the things was the famous Greek astrolabe for navigating. Now, the Arabs and Turks had that same technology, but hadn't a reason to develop it to the same extent because they basically tended not to cross the Mediterranean where they could help it. They sailed coast to coast to coast, and the astrolabe was of some significance. But if you're Magellan and you're beginning to do transatlantic and trans-Pacific voyaging, understanding how to use that Greek astrolabe ends up being incredibly important. But you have to be able to build ships that can withstand the deep oceans. So the West starts developing these more powerful oceans. You have this renaissance taking place, and then you have this explosion of learning through vernacular languages. You have the rise of a new merchant class, eventually known as the bourgeoisie, but these are burghers. And you have the creation of new capital markets. None of this is happening in the East. New capital markets. They create a stock market in London and Amsterdam. Then they created an insurance market. These were new technologies, and heretofore, all wealth had really come from royalty. Now there's a new source of wealth in the West, and a wealth that was looking for a profit. And we create mechanisms, a joint stock company, where you could lay off the corporate risk so it didn't extend beyond the investment in the corporation, and where we create an insurance market. And because we know that for every 10 voyages that go out for exploration and resources, maybe 4 of those ships are going to be either hijacked or will go down in a shipwreck, whatever the number is. I'm not sure I want to put my money at risk, but if there's some way to lay off the risk to people who are willing to take a calculated risk, this whole new Western technology, this expansion information, the freedom that the whole concept that Martin Luther essentially brings is in the concept of individual freedom. It gets exploded in the Reformation. These are all things that are happening that allow the West technologically to begin to overcome the Muslim East. But the threats continued all the way, as I say, through the 1680s, where Western Europe might have succumbed if Vienna had fallen. Much of Western Europe might have also succumbed to the advance of Islam. This was in fact the second time Islam was turned back from the West. The first time Islam was turned back from the West was via the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus, the Berbers and Moors, when they arrived and managed to push north of the Pyrenees into southern France, controlled Marseille and so forth, and got as far as Poitiers, got as far as the Loire River Valley, when they were stopped finally by Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, in a battle of 732 AD. That was the first time Europe might have become Muslim. We talk about the First World War, Second World War. America might, in England, speaking German. Well, everybody might have been speaking Arabic in the middle of the 8th century. The Islamic incursion in Western Europe was so threatening. That this is almost 1,000 years later, and they're at the gates of Vienna. Finally, they get pushed back. A lot of things begin to change in terms of technology, and it's well. Let me just jump beyond this. So we now have a stage set where I've talked a little bit about threat perceptions, where they come from, East and West. Trust me, I can also talk about perceptions in the East about Western threats that go all the way back to the Crusades. There was one word that defined threat to a Muslim in the Middle East. One word from the time of the Crusades. Frank. All Crusaders were called Franks because the original Crusaders were by and large French. They were launched out of France. They picked up people from other countries, especially in successive crusades. But the one word you mentioned, Frank, and it would strike fear into families. I've read documents about this. Average people. That's what their threat was. Our threat were threats that go back to the Iliad and go back to the Persians. And the attempt to push back that threat from Alexander, and then the Romans, and then the Byzantines, and then the threat comes again from the East from the hordes, from the Huns and Goths and Visigoths, and then subsequently by the Mongols. So now we have this, the stage is kind of set for looking at the Eastern question. In geographic terms, Eastern now means something. Eastern has this connotation, oh, East is East and West is West. Eastern already by the late 1700s, probably by 1699, when the Ottomans were first had to sign a treaty with the Russians after the Battle of Zenta. It was the beginning of the rise of Russia, Peter the Great, and by the time Catherine arrives, a couple generations later, Catherine now has a full-blown strategic concept of how important it would be for them to control the Mediterranean, control the Black Sea, have an access to a year-round port that doesn't freeze. You remember Vladivostok freezes, and their Archangel area, Navy would get frozen in the winter, whereas Sevastopol and Crimea gave them a navy that Catherine could build, and she had to fight down there, and she basically defeated the Turks in 1773, just before our revolution. In fact, King George tried to hire 17,000 crack Russian troops who just dispatched the Ottomans, and his distant cousin, Catherine, said, I think your whole concept of treating the people in North America is ludicrous, the way you're trying to deal with this rebellion, as you call it, and I have no interest whatsoever in hiring out my people. So he ended up, while King of England, he was also Elector of Hanover, so he was able to go and raise, to make it simple, upwards of 30,000 Hessians as mercenaries to support the British efforts in North America, the Caribbean, and other places. So here we have this world here where this Russia, who understands that it's important for them to expand south, understands the Ottoman Empire is in the way, understands the strategic significance of the Black Sea and the Bosphorus and the connection to the Mediterranean, understands the significance of the land connection to the Middle East and all the trade routes that cross through there. And so you have this competition. But what this is really showing you, this Eastern question, the Russians felt that they had some particular rights because they have plenty of Orthodox people in Serbia and in Greece, and Bulgaria and so forth, and they felt a certain paternal instinct to go ahead and expand their empire down into the Balkans, and they felt as though by geographic proximity and by more recent pilgrimage became so dangerous for pilgrims from the west to try to get all the way to the east, and logistically many Russian Orthodox were making pilgrimages down here into the Holy Lands. And so the whole Russian concept of the Russian bear, which is now a threat from the east, let's call it the northeast, Islam is the southeast, but the threat is from the east. This time now the threat is becoming, nobody sees it particularly, because they're all interested in vanquishing the Ottomans by 1700. But by the middle 1700s, it was clear that Catherine had her eyes on the Ottoman Empire, the Bosphorus, and the Black Sea. The Europeans took note of that, and you basically have what's described here by this geographic guy who made these things. He said, quote, "The stage was set for a war that would come, and come as no surprise. To answer the Eastern question to its advantage, the English and French joined in an alliance in order to defeat Russia's political, religious strategy to move the borders of its empire south, wrapping its bear claws from the Balkans to Suez." So here we have the stage is really set now for the Crimean War. The balance of power, Napoleon finally neutralized, and the whole world seems to be okay in 1815 in the Congress of Vienna, and the balance of power arrangements seem to be on the surface. Everybody seems to be happy, but actually nobody's really happy. So a lot of things start happening, including additional incursions into the Ottoman Empire that make it clear that the Ottomans now are failing. They're failing technologically, they're failing politically, administratively, economically. They're beginning to fail to be able to maintain their empire. At the same time, the Americans have just taken the English and French Enlightenment ideas and turned it into a revolution in America to set an example of a whole new concept called nationalism. And that concept of nation state probably has its origin at the treaties of Westphalia in 1640, but itself a product of the Enlightenment thinking of the time. Now you add the French Enlightenment on top of that after the Glorious Revolution in England. Now you have this idea that sovereignty somehow has moved from being divine to something, if not popular yet, moving in that same direction. America sets up this example, breaks away from its mother country. So it doesn't take very long for the Greeks to figure out that, maybe we should use the same example and enlist the support of great figures like Lord George Byron to write poetry on their behalf, and they start an independence movement in the 1820s. So this is the first incursion of nationalism on the Ottoman Empire that's making everybody, the big powers, both in Russia and Western Europe, nervous. This continues with revolution in Egypt, and continues essentially right through the century. The Ottomans start a war in 1877 with the Russians. They lose it badly, but England and France and Germany now understand that we can't let them take over the Ottoman Empire or the Balkans or what have you. The Habsburgs are very nervous by now in the 1870s, and so these Western empires and England and France come together and said, well, you got to give some of that back. But this dealing with this threat of Russia is very much alive, even well after the Crimean War. So let's just briefly take a look at the war itself, the myth and the reality of the Crimean War. Let me deal for a second with the myth. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew. Someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Tennyson's great poem, the last stanza of which reads, when can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the light brigade, the noble 600. This is a war that was a crossover in the history of modern warfare, and most of you, I'm sure, are aware of this. But this is the first war where it's the tail end of a code of chivalry. Tail end is still being observed. This is 7 years before the American Civil War. It's the first time that electricity and telegraph was available to both sides. It's the first time you had employers using, you had correspondents using modern terminology embedded with the troops and sending out daily dispatches. It was the first time where you had repeating rifles, which worked hugely to the advantage of the technologically superior Western forces, the Russian forces. But from many standpoints, the Crimean War tends to create the concept of something terribly local, but it basically had globe-girdling significance and had the major players in the world engaged in that war. 750,000 people died in that war, disease, 2/3 of them Russian. Some 250,000 of the Russians are said to lie in 3 mass graves in Sevastopol. So This is the way the world looked like, a map of the period here, you all can see in the back. The Crimea here, it's of some significance here. I mean, these are, some Moldavia, Bessarabia, the Dniester, Odessa, just to point it out to you, the Crimea, and significantly here you see that it turns out the Strait of Kerch separates any land connection with Russia. When they invaded 2014, there was no land connection. The land connection is through the Ukraine. So this is what the world looked like. And here is Balaclava and Yalta, just to orient you. Here are some battle sites that every British kid knows so well. The name Balaclava, Inkerman, Sevastopol, Alma. This is the Allied fleet came in from here. And a little rendition of what things looked like at the time. I'm sure you can figure out who the Russians are in this battle. And here are the noble 650 or so going in Balaclava. Here I am last year in October looking at the same battlefield. Anybody here is kind of a scholar of the Crimean War, know anything about it? I won't get any more detail. And if you go further north, you can actually see where that painting was made. It's a little bit hard to see, but the Russians, the valley took the troops here, and Russians had batteries on this high ground, had batteries on this ground, and their main army and artillery were at the back of this, and it's into this group that they charged. They were in fact supposed to chase after, the orders got confused, they were supposed to chase after a retreating, redoubt had been abandoned, the Scots Highlanders had put them under huge pressure, and they were trying to hitch up their cannon and wagons and escape back to where their main forces were. And that's what the Light Brigade was supposed to attack, and instead they went into the main jaws of the Valley of Death. So a lot of people were criticized, to say the least. Lord Raglan, who was the senior commander, Cardigan, Lucan, a lot of finger pointing and blaming. But the fact of the matter is that people knew the story, and they knew the tragedy that had befallen them within days because of the modern telegraph. So there was already public feedback that was coming back, and the population and the politicians were reacting. The aftermath of this, I think, is it's interesting here. This is written by Michael Reynolds, who wrote a book 2 years ago called Shattering Empires. It's at Princeton. He said the Crimean War opened up the Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire to Western armies and technologies, accelerating its integration into the global capitalist economy, and sparked an Islamic reaction against the West, which continues to this day. European Russophobia growing stronger, trumping Turkophobia growing weaker. Russians came away with complete disillusionment that the Christian West had sided with the Turks. So the real aftermath of this is that this would leave the Ottomans on external life support, and the Russians with unrequited aspirations. This is a famous diorama similar. Has anybody seen the one up at Gettysburg of the Civil War diorama, the museum in Gettysburg? No, it was totally redone, quite a few $1 million. I saw it when I was 13. I got to see it last summer, totally redone. out of the same school of art in the late 1880s when people didn't have Netflix at home. One of the things that people used to do was go and see these dioramas. The diorama that's done of the Battle of Sevastopol is literally, in a circular building, is literally extraordinary. And then I quietly went down and hired a guy with a small boat to tour the harbor there at Sevastopol, where I saw rusting. I'm there last October. Rusting Ukrainian warships. Continue around the harbor, looking across one of the big granaries. They're huge. The Ukraine, as you know, breadbasket, huge exporters of grains, primarily used for pasta in Turkey and Italy, by the way. And here's a Russian missile frigate right here. And then I continue around a little bit more, and I come across a sub pen. Pull out my smartphone and quietly take a couple pictures and continue on. So I was, believe me, you might be anxious flying into Turkey today. I was so anxious to get out of Russia with knowing what was on my smartphone. But anyway, it was a great opportunity for me to look at Crimea then, and Balaclava had an expert. I mean, we got way off the regular tourist stuff, and this guy was a real expert on the movements of all the Allies and the Russians. And then to have this opportunity to go down the harbor and witness the results of a two-year-old annexation of Crimea. So this basically takes us to today's situation here. And I would argue that America would pick up the mantle of the European West after World War II, as we did everything around the world for France and England and Portugal and Germany. America, through her experience in and around the Mediterranean, which actually began in the 19th century, from its battles with Barbary pirates, the establishment of an embassy at the Sublime Porte in 1831, the work of Christian missionaries in the establishment of what came to be known as the Universities of Beirut and the University of the Bosphorus in Istanbul, all started by the Near East College Foundation, Christian missions in the 19th century. So now we're looking at this world that you hear a lot about with my friend here on your faculty in his book, the Intermarium, Marek Kodakiewicz. This is this world right now that where the Cold War seems to be heating back up again. You can see Crimea in black and the Ukraine. Looking at it a little more closely with Kiev here and Odessa down here, the Crimean Peninsula here, the Strait of Kerch, where the Russians are busy building a causeway to connect so they can move truck traffic across, and Donetsk, the Don River Basin. So this sort of brings us to the current situation today. We're looking at this 21st century of the Eastern question. America has picked up the mantle on behalf of France and England, but the concerns are the same. They're now seen through America and through the eyes of the EU and through NATO. And this area in blue is the Don Basin, which has for actually quite some time, going back into the 1800s, they had discovered, late 1800s, discovered very pure strains of coking coal, and this has been a strategic place for building steel. For a long time it was a major objective of the Germans in World War II, precisely for that reason. And we're looking at this pro-Russian separatist movement, like various movements, separatist movements, seeing various places around the world, where Ukraine essentially becomes, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, becomes a country again. Ukraine was a country for about 2 years after World War I, and then Stalin took it over. So the whole idea of Ukraine is one that has been historically challenging for Ukrainians to geographically, philosophically, historically rationalize. If there was ever a time when Ukrainians controlled Ukraine, it was probably in the middle 1600s, when most of what we know of modern Ukraine today was controlled by the Cossacks of the Ukraine. So from, if not 1773, certainly by 1783, until 1954, when Stalin made a gift of the Crimea to the Ukrainians. The Crimea had been a part of Russia for hundreds of years.
It was Khrushchev in the 60s, actually.
Pardon me?
It was Khrushchev in the 60s.
No, it was Khrushchev in 1954.
Yes, but he just done.
Yeah. So I don't know what I said, but it's Khrushchev in 54. So anyway, one of the things that people forget, and the importance of religion here when we look at the Eastern question, it continues to be an issue and a leverage or fulcrum point, is that the Russians think of Chersonesus, which is this little town that was at once upon a time a Greek colony in the Crimea, as the site of where Vladimir I accepts Christianity on behalf of the Kievan Rus. Again, in that 11th century period, when all these things are happening. So Russians have thought that Crimea should belong to them for a long time. Catherine sort of made it a reality, and that lasted till Khrushchev gave it away as a gift, not mostly because it was a liability for the Russians at the time, but made to look like a gift. And then they become independent again with the fall of the Iron Curtain, as you all know. And since then, trying to establish Ukraine, and has almost by definition been problematic for them from the beginning, but certainly the early part of this century. And the ethnic divides between the largely Russian-speaking and largely Russian people of the Dog Basin sort of resent the fact that Ukraine's making noises about joining the EU, and the EU is making certain tantalizing suggestions that they might get there one day, and the Russian people in the eastern part of the country are feeling very nervous about this, and they are supported by Putin and the Russians, who consider this part of their natural buffer zone. In fact, the Ukraine has been a buffer zone for everybody throughout the last 500 or 600 years. So we have these natural clashes here that I'm afraid are going to continue. I thought I couldn't resist this picture, a pro-Russian separatist here. I understand you have to be pretty careful now. There's a lot of fake news propaganda being done. Same guys in changing costumes and depending on what they're trying to promote, but that's something literally a little bit more recent. And in America, under Obama, trying to honor our commitments to Eastern Europe and the prospect of them possibly coming in, has sent special attachments from people from the 101st Airborne, who are sitting trying to train Ukrainian forces to deal with Russian separatists and Russians. Some of the tactical work for the training that's going on here is actually done at the Ground Intelligence Center in Charlottesville, Virginia, which I've discovered a few weeks ago for somebody who's involved in this Ukraine a couple times in the last year, also served in Syria, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the whole thing is becoming predictably complicated, but if you don't understand the connection between this historic reach of the Russian bear, which is not only down into the Balkans, but is also down into the Middle East, for reasons we've discussed already, you can't quite appreciate how happy the Russians are, who are, as you all know, are obliged to find some stability and support Assad because they have a navy base and now they have an air base. But it's an historic interest for the Russians to be involved in the Middle East, and arguably they've been forced out after the Mossadegh affair in Iran and hadn't been real factors in the Middle East since 1953. So they're back, and they're here to stay in the Middle East, making life more difficult, making drawing lines, red lines, more difficult. And if you don't think that the Russians and the Eastern question are alive and well vis-a-vis the Middle East, here's a meeting that took place 6 months ago with U.S. Joint Chief Dunford and Hulusi Akar, the Turkish chief, and Gerasimov, the Russian, all sitting around the same table, trying to decide what to do with Syria. And that's just, that picture is there a date on there? I believe it was, yeah, in March 7th that meeting is taking place. So we find ourselves, once again with this Eastern question, dealing with threat perceptions from the East becoming more crystallized in the Ottoman period on how to deal with the apparently inevitable collapse of the sick man of Europe, of the Ottoman Empire. And neither the Crimean War, nor the First World War, nor the Second War resolved this question, this Eastern question. It simply got tabled for another century. And I would argue we are dealing with in so many ways the same issues, the same strategic and the same tactical issues today. So I like to think of this. I'm reminded of Mark Twain, who said that while history doesn't repeat itself, it certainly rhymes. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.